um, the competition between political Islam and Muslims who happen to be Muslim and who are in the public circuit as secular people, because there is a nasty tendency of some people to engage the Islamists precisely to delegitimate the national aspirations of any particular country. You got to be very careful. Sometimes people will embrace Islamists to delegitimate. So in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you got to be very careful that somebody's not embracing Syria in order to undermine Palestinians. That somebody's not embracing the Islamists in order to undermine the Palestinian national movement that's been secular. It's very complicated. But all of these debates should ideally happen in a public discourse of realism. What's most likely to create the best outcome? And if you can argue that the best outcome, with the least amount dead and the least amount resources wasted, is to engage Japan in 1937, or to engage them economically, be very generous, or today with Hamas, to have them at the table, but somehow find a way to not give Palestine over to them. And the same thing in Lebanon, engage Hezbollah, but find some way to not give Lebanon over to Hezbollah and their proxies in Iran and Syria. How do you do that? Then that's actually may end up being more realist than the realist position that no, we gotta just smash these guys because they're dangerous, because political Islam is inherently dangerous. But that may end up being a more waste of life and waste of resources. I mean, if we knew before Iraq, the amount of money that's been spent on the Iraqi war it boggles the mind. I think we're going to be paying for generations just for the interest. The interest alone is $25 billion a year. Just the interest on what we owe now because of the war. And if you think about what could have been spent before in order to buy out anybody who would want to participate in weapons of mass destruction and nuclear proliferation, all the bogeymen, all the great concerns of realism, what that money could have done. There is also, some argue in our field, that violence happens because of a paucity of a poverty of ideas, a poverty of imagination. And that's a very interesting and important thing to explore that you should think about in your writings as well. It's why I encourage each semester of students who write the papers to have, a good third of the paper to be your own imagination and explorations by the end of the paper of what you think should happen and why you think it should happen. Your recommendations. Because imagination and out-of-the-box thinking is exactly what's often missing. There is this pervasive sense, this unimaginative sense that either there's a military option or there's passivity in the face of difficult opposition. Yeah.
I was talking to a professor over at School of Public Policy this morning, an economist, Jack High, and we were talking about opportunity cost. And I've never taken an economics course before, macro, so I'm learning about this as we go. But it makes a lot of sense. And he was saying there's an opportunity cost. There's an opportunity cost for me being here right now. I have to pay tuition. I've given up earning income. I've given watching TV right now. So there's a trade-off. So we were talking about the opportunity cost of this war. And the war in Iraq, as you said, is probably right now, the actual dollars we spend is somewhere around $600 billion. but the long-term costs are pushing $3 trillion. So we're talking about the long-term opportunity costs of the U.S. having a military budget of nearly $1 trillion, and what that could do around the world in development and aid. And we're talking about those things are hard to define, like the Marshall Plan. We talked about it's $20 billion, but it's intangible to talk about what goodwill was. We went into Europe and rebuilt Germany, and as well as France and Great Britain and Japan. So he's saying we got to figure out a way to make these opportunity costs more vivid, so people can understand it.
Exactly.
I think what you're talking about. How do we be realistic that the Marshall Plan worked and led to 50 years of peace in Europe, rather than the war plans worked because the amount of money we're spending here. It's cheaper. He's working in his head on how to prove that peace is more cost effective than war.
Right.
And he was saying the same thing. Nobody's really working on this right now.
No, because it involves an imaginative world of what ifs, and also a kind of freedom that people feel. There's something about the culture right now, and it may be because the United States is the most powerful nation on earth, that is discouraging that kind of thinking. And I don't think it's, there's nobody pressuring anybody, but it's simply, it's an academic exercise that's simply rarely done. Now, I would disagree with one thing you said. I agree with everything you said. I disagree with one thing. You don't, because a lot of this is strategy, about a realist entry into the public discourse. I would never say, what could we do with the $1 trillion of the military budget differently, because the immediate emotional reaction is, we have to defend ourselves. Or we have real enemies, this is crazy. It would be looking at the boondoggle of Iraq and saying, okay, we were persuaded that this was a legitimate war. What is the opportunity cost of that war? What could be done with $600 billion? Let's talk realistically. Pakistan, other places of danger, what could be done? And somebody should work out the numbers.
Like schools, hospitals.
Yeah, it's like how much
healthcare.
money is spent on madrasas in Pakistan? Somebody knows that number. It's not, it's not rocket science. How much does it take to feed every child in Pakistan one meal a day in the context of an education? This is not rocket science. And yet nobody's working on it. And that's where a field like conflict resolution needs to stimulate other fields. And one of the fields that's actually missing from ICAR is economics. And I've felt that economics and history are missing from ICAR. And a lot of what we're talking about here is the lessons of history and a precise understanding of economics that can translate the preferred values of conflict resolution into a realistic construct, a realistic assessment of what is wasteful and what is efficient, and maybe even what's safer and not safer. We can calculate, yeah, go ahead, Bex. No, Marissa.
You mentioned the United States being the most powerful country in the world, and I just feel like there's some problem with how we construct power, how we define it, how we express it in terms of the world. What does it mean that we're most powerful? How do we hold on to that power then? There's that fear that we'll lose that power, but what does that power really mean? How do we express that in the world? And is there a way to reframe it so that it's expressed in a different way?
Right.
Does it have to be by brute force? Does it have to be by destruction, like booming everybody, being the boss, having everyone come to us? And is it really that great to be the most powerful country in the world? Aren't there some other countries who are doing, they're not falling apart, they're not the best, right. But what is this obsession? I feel like it's polluted our political environment and everything. What is this power? What does it mean? What do we give up for it? Heat it.
Okay.
Well, not exactly involved with that, but I think two things. One thing is that I really see an absence in the values of capitalism generally in the conflict resolution field, because it seems to me that pacifists tend to view capitalism as a really, really bad thing. I think anti-capitalism and pacifism tend to like run together in sort of this strangely ultra-liberal way, which really prohibits a lot of this kind of creative discourse about, you know, the economic value of peace, which is, you know, important. And also, it really, I mean, there are a lot of people that, when you make an economic argument, I have a lot of very firm Republican friends who, you know, they're very pro-war, they're military families. When you make an economic argument about the cost of this war and how it literally affects their children and their children's education, they do a 360 real fast, or a 180 actually. You know, and I think there's an absence of that that's very problematic because of
The left-right divide.
the left-right divide.
Exactly.
And additionally, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I have an aunt who is, and she really draws a connection between the space race and the focus on, you know, the left brain, you know, math and science and things like that, in the school system of the like late 50s and 60s, and what's happening now in terms of a lapse in creative thought in nonviolence and solutions to global warming and all of these things. I just wanted to
I don't
bring
think you
that
need
up.
to be a conspiracy theorist to see that an exclusive focus on development, expansion, capitalism will demand and need much more of the hard sciences. And then there are debates back and forth, because sometimes the people go too far, and you do need imagination. But a lot of it is is geared towards expanding the system. The interesting question, and we're you know, capitalism has won in many ways. I mean, it's not even a question anymore. But there is a misunderstanding of the average business tycoon. And I think that all my experience at the World Economic Forum in the last few years suggests to me that a large portion of the great business leaders of the world are actually much more peaceful than people think. They don't connect the dots between a level of greed, which is called efficiency, that creates misery, that in turn creates violence. In other words, that connection of the pure maximization of efficiency that leads to sweatshops, that leads to misery, that leads to people developing radical philosophies within the context of religion. That they don't necessarily get as much. But they're not itching for wars. It's a rather small band of capitalism that loves war. And that's where people, you know, have made a mistake about the opportunity here to create a better alliance between businesses and conflict resolution. It's just a matter of managing, you know, it's managing these subtleties of I think there's tremendous opportunity, in other words. And it's not, especially now that we've had this catastrophe of Iraq, and also an evolving business culture in Europe that is very pacifist, actually. There's a lot of things emerging that are possible here as alliances. So, yeah, I do want to. One thing I wanted to. Yeah, go ahead. And I want to get back to Marissa's thing in a second. Go
I
ahead.
want to get back to the previous point about conflict prevention.
Yeah.
I think the biggest barrier there is, like, if a conflict doesn't happen, then you can't really, there is really no evidence to say that, oh, we
Right.
prevented it. Because if
Exactly.
it didn't happen, how do you know you prevented it? I think it is the difficulty in getting these programs off the ground or anything, is that how are you going to prove that we saved this much money by preventing that conflict? Because if a conflict happened, we can say, oh my God, we wasted this much money on the conflict that happened. But how can you, like, quantify something that didn't happen, or you prevented?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, but I think it's a poverty of imagination, because let's take, you know, what do you do in science when you want to experiment? You have a control group, and then you have a place where you do something, and there's a place where you do nothing. So let's take North Korea and Iraq, or North Korea and Iran. And in one place you aggressively moved, under one administration you moved towards agreements, and then after 6 years of not, suddenly you do, in order to shore up your Asia theater, because most of your conflicts are going to be in the Middle East. Whatever reason, you can calculate and ask yourself, what would we be spending right now on a North Korean crisis? Let's play out a couple of scenarios. Let's say it was just deteriorating and they were building more nuclear weapons and so on, and what would that require from the Japanese industry and the nuclearization? Would Japan be developing a nuclear weapon right now? They would have to, right? There would have to be nuclear weapons development. Maybe the United States would be putting far more ships in that region. What does that cost? But let's say it was worse than that. Let's say there were shots fired between North Korea and South Korea. What would immediately happen? We can calculate that in terms of the cost. What would worst case scenario? Nuclear exchange. North Korea can wipe out Seoul in a second. It's right across the border. Be a few million dead. What would it cost to conduct an unconventional war with North Korea? Versus what we didn't have to pay. So I don't see any articles like that. Not in the papers and not even in the scholarly journals. So you can do that. And then you can say, well, what are we paying now for the way in which we pursued discovering nuclear weapons in Iraq? I think you can do that. And it would be a happy marriage between conflict analysis and economics that has yet to be born in terms of shifting these realist arguments to different. One of the reasons why Bill Clinton is just enormously popular around the world is that these are the kind of speeches he makes. He doesn't use the word opportunity cost because he's too smart to use jargon. But that's basically what he's talking about all the time. Talking about the value of malaria nets and what was saved as a result and so on. You can do that. We do it in development all the time. What's the cost versus the non-cost of inoculations or of other things? I just want to say to you that Joseph Nye wrote a book on soft power. He's a dean realist dean at Harvard in the Kennedy School, and you see percolations in popular notions now of a different approach to power. Now again, I sit here and I think much more radically about the Tao Te Ching and about Taoist approaches that really call into question the whole notion of what is truly powerful and what is not. But Joseph Nye, in needing to speak to the corporate elites and especially the military elites, was making a case for soft power in a much, much more realist way, with a much more crass notion of American national interest. How to persuade everybody to be on our side. Now, I never would frame things that way. Nobody in conflict resolution would, because we tend to have a more universal perspective than narrow national interest. But on the other hand, we have to face the fact that we have an engine of government and of agencies that are mandated to focus on national interest. But the fact is that you can frame it that way. And you can make a case. You can translate the Tao Te Ching's notion of what is soft and what's really hard into notions of soft power, and then calculate what the cost benefit is of going with the hard power versus the soft power. So there are percolations of this, but it hasn't really taken over the public discourse, especially because of 9/11. But now we have an 8-year failed experiment in the use of hard power that may allow for this to become, a new cultural approach to the use of power.
Professor, but that's also assuming that there are no other events around the world that can disrupt those calculations. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why there's this reluctance to, incorporate that idea in the debate.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with you that other things can cause things to go back again, but in terms of the only thing that if another 9/11 happens, and it's not if we go through it again, then it's not going to be the same as the first time. It's not going to have the same shock value. If it's geometrically greater, like nuclear, then yeah, it would have a catastrophic effect on democracy and all sorts of things. So yeah, there's a power to violence that trumps many things. There's no question, and that's I don't have much of an answer to that.
But the other issue you were talking about in trying to do a cost analysis is, Rumsfeld told us that the war in Iraq would cost $50 billion. So whose numbers do you use on what it would cost to have a hot war in North Korea? I mean, was Rumsfeld a true believer that it was going to cost $50 billion? Or was he just misleading us all? Because that number is so below the par.
I wouldn't be surprised if I think that his my personal opinion is that his understanding of human nature is so thin that he honestly thought that he could get away with doing that.
So when we talk about North Korea with the hot
just
war,
wrong.
how much money do you put in that equation? $50 billion because they're they're poor and they don't have the real wherewithal to fight us, and do you know what I'm saying?
No, but you also have to. I mean, like for example, let's say you are risking a nuclear incident with North Korea. So they do fire a weapon and 1 million people die. What is the cost of 1 million people dying to a modern economy? You have what South Korea's economy, how interactive is South Korea's economy with the rest of the world? I'd say it's highly interactive.
Yeah.
So we don't even have any contemporary examples of what kind of impact the destruction of South Korea, because it would really only take, I mean, people overestimate these kind of things. One nuclear weapon is enough to set a country back, for generations.
Sure.
And in this delicate modern economy that we have, you just imagine. Well, calculate it. What would happen if all of South Korea's products and its interaction with the world would just disappear? I think we can calculate that. It would it would be in the trillions.
Sure.
Or worse, Japan's.
And the same with
Tokyo.
if North Korea, if you then strike North Korea and now North Korea strikes Japan, the whole economy of the world. So just put a number on it. Have the courage to put numbers on things and say what would happen if there was a collapse of the global economy because Japan was struck by North Korea. Now this isn't like fantasy, because we're facing the same question about what's going to happen if Iran is attacked and cuts off the Gulf oil. What's going to be the cost?
The global depression.
Right. Well, people say these kind of nightmare scenarios, but they don't put a dollar on it. And you're exactly right about your Republican friends, because people do want a realistic assessment. They don't want you to say the sky is falling down. They want to tell you, what are the options here? Then you can disagree about the numbers. They can say, no, that's too much. Say, okay, half that. Half of $600 trillion, and we'll recover in 10 years, not in 30 years. And only 100 million people will starve to death, not 200 million. Globally.
Favorite child, and that one can go to school.
So let's but get into the numbers, because I think that idealists have tended to not want to get into numbers. They want to persuade people emotionally and morally, and appeal to their conscience, and I think that's a good thing. But it's not enough when there's an awful lot of people who have made a determination in life, for whatever reason, that Ayn Rand is right, and it's number one comes first. But number one is far more interdependent with the world than anybody realizes. And it's always been this way, but it's even more so now. So indulge that. I think I want to try to move on, but if somebody hasn't spoken yet. I think we should move on to the things that we were going to cover today, okay? Because this was a good digression, but I want to move on to finish up some of the themes in the the Arab-Israeli conflict, okay? Share with you some stories and then have you reflect on them, okay? So let's take a break until 6.
He's not going to be here.
And then we'll come back.